Welcome to this edition of Theological Journals, Part 1, on the 5th of November 2022. We are on Higton's article in Anglican Theological Review, who's talking about Tanner's Christology. We can go further than this, however. An underlying receptivity is present even when Jesus is presented simply as an agent, as the one who confidently speaks and acts on his own initiative. When he preaches, for instance, he speaks the language of his people, time, a medium he has received from those around him. When he acts, his acts make sense against the background of the scriptures that he has learned to read with others. Look more deeply, we might begin to see that there is, in one sense, nothing in his action that is not first received. His action is unique. I think we can say this of Jesus' holiness. God brings it about that at each moment of his existence, Jesus lives a life transparent to the life, light, and love of God over against the sinfulness of the world. This deification is not, however, achieved by protection of Jesus from the world. That's a big statement. That is, it is not achieved by the substitution of the influence of the Spirit for the influence of Jesus' fellow creatures upon him. I'm getting a little bit too naked meat. I'm watching closely. It is not achieved by strictly internal influence that can be set up against all external influences. Tanner's language at times suggests this, as when she speaks of the Spirit as interior power for action within Jesus, saying it is the Spirit is in him as his own power, as the interior motor for human life. I think we have to say instead that the deification of Jesus' humanity by the Spirit, that sounds very adoptionistic and raises questions for us about his view of the eternal sonship of God. We should not therefore conceptualize Jesus' holiness as overcoming of creaturely dependence. It does not involve separation from interaction, relationship, and receptivity. It is a work of providence, or something like providence, working in and through creaturely existence. Jesus is who he is. His story goes the way the story goes. His life communicates light, and the love of God in the way that it does. Only because of what he receives and goes on receiving from the people, animals, environment, institution, texts, and objects that surround him. This is not good Christology. That whole story is the means by which the light love of God is expressed. The whole story is God's healing of broken humanity. We've got some problems with this man. And if this is what we say of the incarnate one, we might also speak differently about all those of us who are incorporated into Christ. We might in particular not focus in quite the same way upon our agency. In the first place, we might talk about the whole body of Christ. But we won't simply talk about it as a place where we find the activities of worship, baptizing, celebrating the Eucharist, and so on, that the Spirit awakens and that mediate the Spirit's work. We will talk about it as a body in which all who are being united to Christ are members, and in which they are becoming both gifts to one another and recipients of the gifts that others are becoming. As Rowan Williams says, that filiation that characterizes Jesus is in some measure lived out in believers in an organic interdependence that radically changes our involvement with and responsibility for others. To become a member of this community is to become a recipient, to go on receiving and learning how to receive. It is to become a recipient and to go on receiving and learning how to receive even in our own agency. We have a word for that article, baffle-gabbing. But it does raise the issue of Christ in, about, around, with, under, strengthening us. Oh, hi, Mary. Good to see you. But we're watchful also against pantheism and panentheism. Well, we are with. Good to see you, Mary. We're beginning our work here a little bit later today. We're in Trinity Evangelical Divinity School's Journal, an article by Elizabeth Backfish, who's arguing or discussing variations within accounts in the book of Judges, variations that amplify and explain another statement or so. Judges 16 and 6 and verse 10, Judges 16, 13, and 15. Unfortunately for Samson, that deep desire for female love and affection would also be his downfall. Moreover, his femme fatale would prove to be just as effective with her nagging as Samson was with his parents. It takes Delilah 4 separate appeals to finally extract from her lover the truth of his great strength. Each exchange is punctuated with Delilah's exclamation, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you," which invites readers to view each exchange in parallel and heed the subtle and some not so subtle exchanges. Delilah's first request is itself a varied repetition from the request of the Philistine lords in verse 5, omitting only the part about overpowering him. And it seems a bit, suspicious to modern readers. Webb argues that from Samson's perspective, Delilah is not truly attempting to subdue and afflict him, but rather she wants him to prove his love to her by telling her the secret that every other Philistine wants but cannot have. This lover's game, if that is how readers should think of it, is a dangerous one and a well-played one, considering Samson's weaknesses for love and for danger. We'll pick that up again. How nice. Grandson is spending the afternoon with you. He's actually being home schooled here. And he asked earlier today if I could pray for his brain. And then he came down at noon and asked for the same thing. So with Thomas Aquinas, the prayer to acquire, receive, retrieve, retain, those 4 or 5 things that Aquinas would pray for regularly. It's going to probably be a regular feature here. Very good prayer by Thomas Aquinas. Turn to Anglican and Episcopal history. And we're doing book reviews here. Book In Spirit and Truth, A Vision of Episcopal Worship, edited by Stephanie Boudwy, Keith Maroney, Sylvia Sweeney, and Samuel Torvend, published by Church Publishing 2020. This should be interesting. This collection of articles resulted from the collaborative efforts of 15 members of the Anglican Colloquium of the North American Academy of Liturgy. All of them are aware of and involved in the long-term process moving the revision of the Book of Common Prayer, 1979. The authors share the mutual conviction that if we Episcopalians want to embrace new liturgies, we must first invite them to see the need of new liturgies. So the intention is for the book to be used at the parochial level as a means of introducing the revision process and its goals. The process of future revision was initiated at the passage of Resolution A068 at the Church's General Convention 2018, and I strongly suspect the direction will be to weaken the doctrine of prayer, of confession, and to introduce same-sex blessings, which will be a major setback and a disaster. That resolution had 15 resolves, each of which identified different aspects and qualities to be included in the future revision. It provided for a task force on liturgical and prayer book revision to guide the process. This book is unofficial support for the beginning of the process. The structure of the book is quite simple. Each author took responsibility for commenting on one of the elements of the General Convention's resolution. Each wrote within a 6,000-word limit. At the end of each chapter is a set of discussion questions for congregational use. Appropriate to the book's unofficial nature, there's no intention for congregations to summarize and report the results of any discussions. The implication is that it is sufficient to have fruitful initial engagement in local churches. The authors are all experts in the history and liturgies of the church, so they bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to bear on their chosen topics. This is a non-technical book, devoid of footnotes and specific references, though there is a dense 8-page bibliography at the end. Nevertheless, some articles have technical language, concepts, and extended sentences with which academics are familiar. In addition to looking to the future, woven through many of the articles is the usually subtle idea that the options and adaptive possibilities of the Book of Common Prayer 1979 have been minimally explored and little used. Implicit is the hope that new and flexible liturgical practices will begin now, rather than waiting for the assurance of a future revision. Also unstated is the belief that such creativity in the present would aid the process of revision. The authors give no hint of being aware that this perspective is akin to that which gave rise to its formation. One article is intentionally devoted to the issue of meaning of common in the concept of common prayer, that there's an inevitable tension between liturgical diversity and cultural adaptation on the one hand, and common prayer on the other. The authors touch on this tension, and because of the complexity, many readers will not be satisfied with the results. The closest approach to resolution is that the concept of common in the Book of Common Prayer meant all of the people of the nation of England back in the day. And it would be fair to say that it was up until 1980 that there was tremendous unity worldwide. If you go to a church in America or Australia or England before 1980, and you'd recognize the service. But now there's books of common prayer. And the current generation has not been schooled on the old Book of Common Prayer as we use here. Now is the beginning of the discussion of liturgical change in the Episcopal Church. Inevitably, such a beginning has some limitation. Subtle hints are that the authors want readers to understand why the unknown they hope for liturgical changes. Another problem is that many of the discussion questions have a ponderous quality, making discussions difficult. Beyond the author's capacity to affect, an issue is how parishes find this topic worthy of programming and discussion. I'm very distrustful of the structure for cause. We turn now to another book review. This one looks good. Anselm of Canterbury and the Search for God by John T. Slotmeyer. Lexington Books Fortress Academic, 2018, 135 pages and $95. This slim volume seeks to offer the uninitiated an accessible introduction to the theological projects of one of the greatest and often misunderstood theologians of the Western Church, Anselm of Canterbury. Instead of focusing on the more famous proslogion, 1077 to 1078, or the Cur Duomo, 1094 to 1098, Slotmeyer looks to the Monologion, 1077, for an interpretation of Anselm's theological method as a hermeneutical key to understanding the work and thought of the sometime Archbishop of Canterbury. One of the more critical points that Slotmeyer makes is that Anselm's project cannot be reduced to a philosophical argument, nor can it be seen as only a mystical quest for the unknown God, nor as a work of what we now call theology. Such limits between different disciplines did not exist in Anselm's day, and to try and to limit his project as one or the other of these things to the exclusion of others is, at best, to be guilty of anachronism, and at worst, to misread and misunderstand what it is that Anselm was attempting. Each of these misreadings has its proponents, particularly among modern scholars. Too often, the so-called ontological argument for the existence of God has been stripped of its context and presented almost as a curio from the history of philosophy. Likewise, Anselm's teaching on the atonement, the so-called satisfaction theory of the atonement, that the God-man paid the infinite penalty due to God for the affront to God's dignity and majesty by human sin, a penalty that only he could pay, has been caricatured and stripped of context in theology textbooks. Yeah, maybe in some of the ones you might read, but Anselm is one of the great minds on that subject in his book, Cur Duomo, Why God Became Man, as over against Abelard in the same time period. As Slotmeyer argues, Anselm must be understood first and foremost on his terms and in his context, the early 11th century. The late 11th century. To understand him in his context and on his terms, Slotmeyer turns to Monologion, a work that Anselm himself suggests to his readers that they consult before his proslogion and his Cur Duomo. By doing this, he can disentangle Anselm from his commentators and demonstrate that what Anselm was pursuing was a relentless search for God in whom he believed and whom he loved. Anselm's project is well captured in his Augustinian axiom, fides quorens intellectum, that is, a faith that seeks understanding, still a workable project. As Slotemaker notes, Anselm's approach to theology is a method of praying, thinking, reading, and writing about God. This methodology is infused into every work that Anselm wrote. His book, Monologion, demonstrating as it does this methodology, is thus chosen because here the beginner can encounter Anselm's theology and theological method relatively unencumbered by the interpretive strains that are in Proslogion and Cur Duomo. The move to begin with Monologion is not only clever but fruitful, as it allows Slotemaker to advance a refreshing interpretation of Anselm in an economical manner. The first half of the book explores the argument and methodology of Monologion, displaying Anselm's method of search and longing for God through basic investigations on the nature of the triune God. This allows Slotemaker to turn in the second half of the book to the interpretive history of Proslogion and Cur Duomo with a fresh perspective. Having stripped away the accretions of several centuries of commentary, he can allow the methodology demonstrated in the reading of Monologion to inform his understanding of the complex reception of Anselm's works. This allows him to conclude quite reasonably that we miss Anselm's point if we reduce his arguments to a rationalist attempt to prove or calculate the eternal. It is better to understand, as Anselm did, that the eternal Logos is at best only partially and imperfectly understandable, and the search remains incomplete and imperfect, but essential and life-giving. Slotemaker is to be applauded for writing such a brief, accessible, but thoroughly erudite introduction to Anselm and his work. For the uninitiated, this book will prove an invaluable guide to the famed Archbishop of Canterbury, one that, while conversant with the centuries of interpretation between the contemporary reader and Anselm, has not allowed these commentators to shape his own interpretation, but letting Anselm and his irrepressible search for the one God to allow him to speak for himself. Very nice. Sounds like a very fascinating book. We turn to another book review. We're still in Anglican and Episcopal history, and I warn people about becoming Episcopalian. I say that as being one. The book is Teach Us to Pray, the Lord's Prayer, Catechesis, and Ritual Reform in the 16th Century by Kathryn Mahan, again, Lexington Books Fortress Academic, 2019, $95. And usually the academic presses like Oxford, Brill Publishing in the Netherlands, those volumes are always $100 or $150. I'll never know why that's the case, but they price themselves out of the market. Anyways, this is Lord's Prayer Catechesis in the 16th century. As the title of this scholarly and well-researched work indicates, there's more going on in Mahan's study than merely a focus on the Lord's Prayer in the 16th century. The Lord's Prayer is used as a lens to understand what was going on in late medieval Catholicism as it gave way to the reforms of the 16th century. The Lord's Prayer is a key to understanding the larger ritual systems and tracking continuity and reform. With the Lord's Prayer as the lens, the topic of the first chapter, there are three areas of concern: liturgical worship, catechism, and private devotional life. These areas reflect Mahan's interest in larger ritual systems that support the lived faith of the churches in the 16th century. That is, patterns of Christian formation embedded in the larger Christian ritual systems. These three areas are studied concerning three reforming movements: Luther's Revolution, Cranmer's English Reforms, and the work of the Council of Trent. Mahan labels her work as liturgical history, as it examines historical documents beyond what can be found in relevant ecclesial texts. In Chapter 2, a foundational discussion, Mahan begins with her chapter title, Ritual Functions of the Lord's Prayer and Medieval Patterns of Christian Formation. Then follows three dense and thorough chapters as Mahan traces the reforms of those ritual patterns for formation as understood by Luther, Cranmer, and the Catholic reformers during and after the Council of Trent. Chapter 3 discusses the role of catechesis from the late medieval period to the 16th century to demonstrate the notion of the Lord's Prayer as a text of knowledge rather than merely a part of liturgy. As a venue for understanding, the reformers accented the theology behind the prayer and emphasized the notion of God's grace. In this way, the Lord's Prayer is a guide for lay devotions. Chapter 4 focuses on the liturgical and ritual participation of the lay people through vernacular texts. Mahan traces the shift from the late medieval visual Mass to the auditory Reformed liturgies. In Reformed thinking, the Lord's Prayer became a prayer of thanksgiving. For Trent, a focus on the actions of the priest and his duty to include the laity in meaningful worship. For the Reformed-minded, the emphasis was on intellectual comprehension of the liturgy and the Lord's Prayer as the center of Christian devotion and identity. For Trent, the focus was a liturgy that guaranteed communal identification. The final chapter takes up private lay prayer as all parties wish the laity to develop through education a personal prayer life according to confessional ideals. Mahan articulates the importance of private daily prayer for Christian formation, and in the century of Reformation, the Lord's Prayer was central to such activity. In reviewing Luther, Cranmer, and Trent, what is essential is the relationship of the Lord's Prayer and private prayer to communal worship and the sacraments. For example, we have in morning and evening prayer and Holy Communion, the Lord's Prayer. Do it every day. Also, the Lord's Prayer appears in the Heidelberg Catechism. For Cranmer and Trent, private prayer prepared one for public worship. Not so. Got some noises going on in the background here. Life in a library. Not so entirely for Luther. Yet this chapter makes clear the differences between Reformed prayer life and the Tridentine prayer life. The Catholic stress was on the rosary, on recitation, and the priest's role as teacher, who encouraged prayer and penance as virtuous habits. On the other side, the Lord's Prayer is the model of prayer, an exercise of the heart that seeks forgiveness and affection. But what of Geneva? There's a brief discussion of Calvinistic prayer in chapter 5, but some will not find this adequate, for they would argue that Mahan, to be complete, should have treated Calvinism as a fourth source of change and reform. Indeed, Mahan acknowledges that her study was not intended to be exhaustive in her conclusion. Her observation that the Reformed and Anabaptist ritual systems are strands of early modern ritual formation that needed to complete the tapestry. In this study, Mahan shows how the fragmented medieval system was reconstructed into three new ritual systems of the 16th century. How Luther, Cranmer, and Trent reworked catechesis, liturgy, and prayer as each sought new ways or rituals for the formation of Christians who worshipped in the Reformation century. In terms of the Lord's Prayer, the discussion of which often gets lost amid all that Mahan was doing. In Catholic circles, the prayer was superseded by the Ave Maria, but in Protestant circles, it became the pattern of personal prayer. I might add it's also included in the Westminster Shorter and Larger Catechism. Having concluded so, she clarifies that she aimed to go beyond discrete observations, since her overall goal was to see the 16th century ritual moments within the trends of the larger ritual systems. Often the reader, however, can get confused by the complicated and detailed comparisons Mahan makes concerning change and ritual theory. Of course, it would be helpful, perhaps necessary, for readers to have some grounds of the ritual theory as Mahan finds changes in the positioning of the Lord's Prayer, catechesis, and liturgy reflected in ritual taxonomies. I will not be buying that. We'll bring this session to a close and pick up with part 2. We've got Table Talk, Standard Bearer, and some other readings to get done today. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Godspeed. Good to see you, Mary, and others as well. Be back shortly.